and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of All the Angles, the Business of Padel podcast, powered by the Hexagon Cup. This episode, we're going to be talking about match data and performance data. Most of the traditional sports are very well aware and very well developed with regards to their revenue streams as it relates to broadcast deals, as it relates to sponsorship, as it relates to corporate hospitality and ticketing. But one, shall we say, more modern aspect of the mix is match data and how you collect it, what type of data you collect, but then how you use that data in terms of providing it to the players and the coaches to improve their performance and to improve the product on the court. The second area is obviously to engage the fans more, whether it's on an app or on a website, or whether it's with some other kind of gamification of and around that data. And then the third piece is the betting piece, where that data is used to help fuel the betting industry, which is obviously a key engagement piece in any sport mix. So we're going to be discussing how that mix, how that match data piece relates to Padel and where it sits today. So on this podcast, I have three guests. I have Ciaran Skinner, who comes from Skylab, who have just recently launched a product that collects and presents data to the LTA, effectively the British Tennis Association, that also has responsibility of Padel in this country. So he's very well aware of where data is in terms of Padel in the UK market and with regards to performance, but more widely as well. I also have the pleasure of welcoming Kate. Kate Trainor works for Champions Data as the Chief Growth Officer, has a broad range of experiences in the data piece as it relates to other sports outside of Padel and can give us that extra context. And finally, I've got David Lampitt, formerly of Sport Radar, but currently heading up Tennis Data Innovations, a relatively new vehicle that is really tasked with exploring and identifying and rolling out all of the match data opportunities that surround the game of tennis. So thank you very much for joining. Let's start with Padel. Let's start in the micro and let's focus on where Padel is today. Let's start with the process, the collection. So a lot of sports, especially tennis, historically, the umpire would collect the data as they effectively put the scores into their console on the side of their seat. So as a second serve was called or as a score was called, 15-love, that would be pressed into the console by the umpire to let the scoreboard know in the stadium, but immediately it would notify the data suppliers. And that obviously provided a certain level of data. Now, more and more sports are obviously adding technology and software and hardware that sits on top of that initial umpire generated layer. But Ciaran, maybe you can talk a little bit about where are we in terms of the collection of data in the Padel world?
It's a great question and something that we've continued to do our desk research on at Skylab. When I've been doing it myself, sometimes I've been trying to find something that's not quite there. And maybe there'll be examples from listeners of it being done. But when I've asked elite coaches, quite a lot of their data collection is done in a very traditional sense of paper and pen and watching a lot of video and capturing it themselves and obviously keeping it in their notepads and applying their own findings and insights their own way. Obviously now there's a lot of sports technology companies that maybe provide a camera and then some element of data collection through computer vision, either in the camera itself or in the cloud. However, when we've audited these, we've probably had a question about the validity and the accuracy of the data to be suitable for the performance world. So fine and great for maybe more recreational Padel, but not necessarily the level that we thought is needed for the professional game that we'd see in other sports. For example, if they claim 90% accuracy on a shot, but as a 10-shot rally, if you times or 90% by 10, you probably get to a 30% chance that the rally is accurate, which is nowhere near good enough for what we need. And then there's the product that maybe Skylab will do, which will be human resource. So performance analysts will tag the games themselves. There will obviously be a lag of how quickly that will be done. However, that's usually around 3,500 data points per match. It's around 98% accuracy and through quality assurance. And I think that's, from our experience out in the market, that's probably the most accurate and deepest data set there is from there. And it doesn't need a certain camera. So I still feel there's a lot of opportunity and scope in the space to be able to see more advancements in technology to be able to make that data generated automatically. However, right now it's probably at a stage of the sport where a lot of other sports have been, whether that be 10 years ago or in baseball in the 1980s, for example. But thankfully for paddle, technology is out there now, and I think we can catch up really quickly.
I went to a website of a tournament operator recently during a match, and I found pretty much the fan was provided 12 lines of first level data per match, pretty much. All the things that you would expect at that entry level of data. But I was a little bit surprised that there wasn't more being provided to the fans. And it made me question whether you could collect more, because it looked like first level data, the stuff that comes from the umpire. There's no heat maps. There's no where the ball went. There's no maximum height. None of the data that an umpire can collect is in there. So it kind of made me a little, I guess, concerned or aware that actually beyond umpire data, there may not be collection beyond, as you mentioned, the pad and paper that the coach is collecting, which, is proprietary, of course, but it's also fairly kind of rudimentary collection. So Kate and David, maybe you can talk a little bit about, in terms of the collection piece, where is paddle in its journey as it relates to other sports and their data? Like, are they eons behind, or are they actually not that far behind where other sports are today in terms of that collection piece?
So shall I go first, Kate? And I'll talk a bit about tennis, and then maybe you can come in on perhaps a couple of other sports for that context. And just for your listeners, Alex, to give them an idea of what TDI, Tennis Data Innovations, is or does, TDI was set up 3 years ago, roughly, to become a specialist in looking after and exploiting the event data that we can generate around tennis. We're not looking at customer data, we're focused on the event data. And actually, what Ciaran has just outlined is, honestly, not so unfamiliar in a tennis context either. I think up until relatively recently, tennis was in a pretty similar space. So we think about data in 3 tiers, well, actually probably 4 tiers, but 3 main tiers at the moment. So level 1 data, as you referred to it, is the data that the umpire collects. So it's really primarily about the score in the game, in the match at any particular point. So it doesn't go into whether it was a winner or an error, forced error or unforced error, what the type of shot was, whether it was a slice, a smash, a volley, a ground stroke, whatever it may be. So that type of incremental data we call level 2 data. And historically, and still currently in tennis, level 2 data has been collected manually. So actually probably not dissimilar to the process that Ciaran described in paddle, where you have data scouts, manual collectors, analysts who are looking at the matches as they happen and, noting down whether it's on a bit of software or something more basic, but noting down those level 2 data points. Then level 3 data in our tennis context is the data that we can derive from tracking systems. So systems in tennis, at least, like Hawkeye or Fox 10 or Flight Scope, which is part of IMG, or Bolt 6. Those are probably the 4 main kind of tracking systems. And again, as Ciaran mentioned, those tracking systems generally have relied upon quite a lot of hardware. So lots of cameras around the court to track the ball and the players. Now, those tracking systems up until now, or up until relatively recently, have primarily focused on what we call in tennis electronic line calling. So the review system, or the sorts of things, if anyone watches tennis, where a player can challenge and check whether the ball bounced in or out. So it's kind of an in-out call. But what we have done over the last 12 to 18 months is start to use those systems to derive deeper data sets from the tracking information. So obviously those systems and all of the cameras are tracking in real time XYZ coordinates of the ball, of the players themselves, and therefore we can derive a whole host of interesting and useful data. From that, we can harvest it and turn it into insights, whether that is for players, for their own performance, whether it is for broadcast and enhancing the broadcast experience, or indeed downstream for the betting market as well. And we'll maybe come back to that and talk a bit about that later on. So those are the three main kind of areas. So there is a kind of fourth level of data, which is the biometrics. So that's where the players are wearing wearable technology themselves, and then you're able to derive various other information about whether it's heart rate or load and the kind of the stress or the demands that are being put on the player physically in a lot more detail. And perhaps we'll touch on that as well, but that is actually almost like a separate body of data, not least because the legal rights around that data are different, because ultimately that is sensitive personal data. In most legal jurisdictions around the world, there are therefore kind of different requirements around what you can do and how you can do it, and the level of consent or the level of input that the players themselves who are wearing that technology need to have in the process. So I think that's a separate topic, and again, maybe we can come back to that later. So those are the four layers. And actually, when TDI was set up 3 years ago, the data around top level professional tennis, I would say, was still very fragmented. So we had level 1 data. We had the umpire collection systems actually used in Padel as they are in tennis. There are a couple of companies that cross over between the two sports because the scoring systems are the same. But then, as I said, even up to 3 years ago, and even today, even at the top level of professional tennis, the level 2 data has been collected in a really fragmented way, really only collected for broadcast. So if matches were not being broadcast for international media rights or domestic media rights, generally speaking, there was not organized level 2 data collection across the tennis ecosystem. We now do capture that across the whole of the ATP tour. Actually, the WTA on the women's side also has a system to collect level 2 data across all of their matches on the main tour. But then as soon as you step down below the main tour level, so on the men's side, that means the Challenger Tour in tennis, that level 2 collection isn't happening in a coordinated way. So I think actually, I guess the premise of the question was somewhat that Padel has a lot of catching up to do. Actually, I don't think it is too far behind. Some of the things that we're doing now as an organization to advance how data can be used in professional tennis specifically are moving that forward in a way that actually could also be interesting for Padel. So we're now automating the collection of that level 2 data. So the stuff that Ciaran referred to as being collected manually, obviously there's human error involved, but there are also data points that are subjective. If you think about errors and winners, forced errors, there are subjective areas of data collection where different scouts on different days or given slightly different instructions can come up with a variety of different outputs. And from our perspective, one of the key things is to make outputs as consistent as possible, so that if you're a fan watching, you know that kind of the data means the same thing. Even more importantly, if you're a player watching, a player using that data for performance purposes, you know that the data means the same thing. And then lastly, coming back to the betting market opportunity, actually, you can't create betting opportunity or you can't offer bets on data sets where you don't have a consistent measurement, because ultimately the way in which betting works, people are building probability models about the outcome of certain things that happen in the sport. And so if you're trying to build a probability model, but the measurement of the data is being done in a really inconsistent way, you actually can't build a reliable model. And therefore it's effectively, I wouldn't say completely useless, but it's way less viable from any sort of commercialization opportunity from the betting market. So I guess I've covered a lot of ground, and there are a number of different steps in there, but only to say, actually, Padel is not so far behind, perhaps, tennis as a sport in terms of that evolution. And there are certainly things that Padel can be doing or thinking about in that space, which will potentially get it there pretty quickly. As I said, we've made that shift over the last 2 years. Yes, there's investment in that process and in the systems to enable that, but there are also a bunch of advantages strategically in the sport, both from a performance perspective as well as from a commercial perspective. I've spoken for way too long already, so I'll hand over to Kate, because I'm sure, Kate, you've got some examples from other sports as well where you've seen that evolution over the course of the last 5 or 10 years in different sports contexts.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, David. I concur with your point around Padel is not too far off at all in terms of how you can fast track where you want to go. The benefit, I think, as Ciaran mentioned, there's been advancements in technology that are definitely applicable to your sport, which is great. Some of the challenges in other sports, like the invasion sports, are just the congestion of the game. So whilst an obvious answer to a lot of this is optical tracking, the challenges with football or home-based Australian rules, AFL, to a lesser extent, maybe NFL, but congestion is a reality there as opposed to tennis. There's space. There's only ever 2 players or 4 players on a court at any given time. So the advancement in technology can be well utilised while some of the invasion sports are still trying to decipher how can you do that in a game because the players are all around each other, even though they've been working on it 10 years before Padel. The other thing I would point to is that at Champion Data, certainly we've had over 20 years of experience in data collection and software, and pen and paper was how it started as well, like it did with all sports. The key for us is also, and I think it's a key learning in all of the sports that we do work with, is our philosophy is never, analytics for analytics' sake. So it's really ensuring that what are we trying to capture here? What are we trying to say? And that's critical from both a player performance perspective and or a fan or a punter in the betting market. And why I sort of state that, which is relatively obvious, it's very important to work from the inside out. So what matters to a high performance manager is critical to the data integrity that then goes right throughout to betting. So to David's point, it must be the same conclusion on any data point. So it's really interesting. We talk about what's the next innovation and how can we do this amazing virtual graphic layer over a data story to get that fan engagement. But you have to start with the actual credibility and integrity of the data point itself. So I think that's, again, something that is consistent across all sports. And for Padel, I won't say it's easier to do that as opposed to the complexity of a fast-moving invasion sport. But there's just some key learnings already in tennis, definitely, where that can apply. The standardization that David's also talking about with regards to that one source of truth, that's a critical part of any of this data journey for any sport. And I think it's the combination is the sweet spot. So how many points or how many aces scored, but then it's moving into combining that in a software program with the tracking data. So it's not just how fast they ran, but how effective was that? How effective was that run? And I think the interesting thing between performance use data for coaches or players versus fan engagement or betting markets or whatever else it is that you are needing to provide, again, as I said, the data point needs to be the same, but the in-depth detail of that data. I think the merging of the 2 data sets with all of these tracking systems now available to us all and the event capture data, then we start to move into a much more meaningful point of view, whether it's for a coach or a fan. And I will say that the advancement in sports around the world is stages. I don't think any sport has it completely nailed yet. So professional golf capture is heavily reliant on volunteers. So the variance in capability, in credibility, in how fast someone does or doesn't collect that data, there's a whole host of challenges there. And yet, because of how that game is officiated, how it's broadcast, how it's utilised by the betting markets and for fans, there's some allowances there that are okay because of the nature of how long a golf game goes for. So it's really such an exciting opportunity to pick out the best bits of what's working and really customise that for the game.
To Kate's point, which I am like 100% on board with, for us and for the way in which we try and think about data, particularly when we're presenting it to fans of the game, whether they're watching it on a TV screen or whether they're betting on it, we talk about insights. And for us, the difference between a data point and a statistic and an insight is that you're actually bringing a bit of extra meaning to the person who's receiving that information. So an example would be performance on break points in tennis, and the same could be true of Padel, right? So we see that the player has converted 3 out of 8 break points or whatever it is in the match. But actually, for me, that is actually too close to a statistic and not close enough to an insight, because when I see that, I want to know how often that player saves the break points at 30-40 or 15-40. And actually, as a tour average, how often do players get out of that scenario and save the break points, rather than just how many break points have happened in the match today? I want that wider context. And that for me then becomes an insight that buys me in to what's going to happen next. Are they going to do what they normally do? Are they going to kind of successfully defend that? Or is something else going to happen? And I think that if we get that right in terms of the way we present data, we make a real difference to the way in which we can engage our fans.
And David and Kate, you both touched on biometric data, and actually I'd love to spend a few minutes on that, because I saw recently an announcement by the Professional Triathletes Organization, who showcased the level of biometric data that they are now sharing. And they talked about how they don't want to show flat out heart rates, because they find that to be too medically sensitive, but they repurposed it as how much are they going above their standard capacity. So as a percentage increase on what's expected, to show where they are pushing harder or where they are relaxing. So it's less the raw medical data and more of an interpretation of that data, even though it's completely statistical. And I was actually quite surprised to see that level of data being provided by a sports rights holder to fans. Where are we in that journey? Because as you said, David, for a long time, it was a no-go. Everyone had wanted that data, heart rate, sweat, all of those things that really give that next level of insight, next level of understanding of how people react to stress. Are they as cool as a cucumber, or is their heart rate through the ceiling? And it's always been fiercely contested and fiercely protected by players' associations or individual players. We're starting to see that creep in a little bit more. And obviously, I guess the rights holders are getting a little bit savvier about how to package it, how to communicate it, and then obviously how to negotiate it. But speaking more generally, before we try and apply it to Padel or not, how is that conversation evolving from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, the players' involvement in that process is just a critical piece of the jigsaw, right? Ordinarily, with kind of the wider sports data or the event data that we were talking about up until this point, ultimately the sports organizers who organize for that data to be collected from the umpire's chair or via a data scout or via a system that doesn't interfere in any way or touch on the players or require the players' involvement. I guess the legal setup around that data is reasonably well established, and the rights holders and the sports organizers can do that. And then ultimately that should benefit the entire ecosystem within that sport in terms of any commercial return that is generated. I think the biometric data and from wearable technology, as I said, it's different. It's different from a legal perspective because you require the players to agree to wear the technology in the first place and then to consent to how that data is used. So I just think the players have to be a critical part of any path towards using that data. But as you say, some sports have already found a good route to do that. I think professional squash has started. There are other examples, even in rugby. We've started to see, certainly in the UK, some of the heart rate or stress level monitoring when the kicker is about to take a key kick or a key shot at goal, right? So there are elements in specific areas or perhaps specific use cases where that has been surfaced. But I think generally speaking, the idea that this data can be used actually to benefit the players and benefit the welfare of the players, actually as a collective, not necessarily thinking about using it commercially or putting it on a TV screen, but actually just looking at the collective of biometric data around professional athletes and how they're impacted by, travel patterns, sleep patterns, how they're affected by the time of day that they have to play their matches. There's been quite a bit of coverage in tennis about matches being played particularly late at night, right? So does that actually impact on the kind of the physical stress that players then have to undergo? So I think there's a very positive and actually player-focused set of use cases or set of benefits that can be derived from collecting this data and ensuring that actually the sport is being managed and is being administered and organized in a way that also protects the long-term health and well-being of its professional athletes who are the stars of the show, right? So I think there's that layer, and then there is the layer of can that data then be returned to the players themselves for their own performance purposes? And again, I think that's something that certainly in tennis and in men's professional tennis, we've seen strong demand from the players for that, because they wear these technologies now in training, right? So when they're training, they're wearing some of this wearable technology. So they're measuring the physical demands of them from a training session or whatever else. But actually, the ATP made the decision just over the last couple of months to enable and allow wearable technology to be used in competition. So then for the first time, the players can also manage or measure how is my body kind of performing and being affected in competition versus training, and therefore how can I manage my own training regime to better be ready for the stress that I'm under and the demands that are put on my body in those match situations. And I think the last point that I would make, just again, about there being maybe a blended way in which some of that data can be surfaced. And we've seen in tennis, the US Open actually last year, I think, introduced the idea of a physical index, a health bar. And actually, to your point, Alex, you're not giving a specific heart rate reading at a point of particular stress, but you can look at that over the course of, say, a really intense 3-set or 5-set match in a Grand Slam, and look at like how the physical load that those players are bearing might have an impact on their performance, but also how that compares to their physical load in other matches, or the average sort of physical load that a player would expect to have to endure in a normal 3-set match. And it just brings that context.
And Ciaran, from your side, have you seen players that you're dealing with or coaches that you're dealing with looking for biometric information, wanting biometric information, asking if you can collect and package it for them? I'm not even talking about commercially here. I'm talking about for themselves.
What we found, they certainly want to add that layer of context to the event data, and technology now allows that. So whether tools can ingest data from different sources, and then we can marry them up. For them, what's really important in the sport, that they have the practitioners that understand how to leverage it too. So instead of just passing a player or a coach, here's a dashboard, here's a load of data, do your best. It's really important for the sport, especially padel and its professionalization and the growth of it, is that they have the expertise to be able to use it properly. But I think, building on the back of David's point, the sport's got a great opportunity for that converged approach where collectively it could all be captured, but certainly packaged in different ways to benefit different parties and different verticals. And that might help the buy-in of players and coaches, which in the past may have been more resistant to these things. So, for example, for the television and maybe the triathlon example you gave, the heart rate data will be collected, but what's presented to the wider public might be a percentage of how far away they are from max heart rate or what training zone they're in. And that also makes it maybe a bit more interesting or applicable to people watching. But the practitioners, the performance ones, can use the raw data if they wanted to be able to apply their own performance questions to it. And I do think all sports are getting more open to this. We recently saw Cristiano Ronaldo wear a wearable in football and present the data through a penalty shootout of what his heart rate was and how cool he was and things like that. What I did thought was interesting is that he didn't publicize the data what happened in 90 minutes, which I think would be something that you may want to hide, maybe with age or how much running, or comparing it to what maybe did previously. So it's getting there. I was quite surprised to see it, but straight away people can sit on the sofa watching the football and going, oh my word, he's taking that penalty and he's got a lower heart rate than me. So it certainly adds that context, but I think that converged offering to suit different departments, whether it be commercial, social media, content, performance, and then gambling, but thinking it is a whole solution is certainly a way to benefit this.
The other point that I would make is more around examples of the way players were using wearables to not only provide exciting data for broadcasters or fans, but for key concussion analysis. So years ago, NFL players, there were chips in their mouth guards. So there's been lots of those things that have been trialled. Chips in balls are now happening frequently as well in rugby, in football, and in Australian rules, again, to improve player performance, dynamics, analytics, but also to make things more exciting for fans.
Yeah, I think chips in the balls and in the rackets would be incredibly interesting for padel because there's so much spin and top spin and slice involved in a lot of the key shots. So I would definitely advocate for that if the technology existed for padel to really embrace that.
Your spin point is a really interesting one because that's one of the elements that we've unlocked with the tracking data that we've now got on all of our courts, is that we can assess shot quality basically in tennis at every shot that is played by players on court based on not only depth, speed of the shot, actually height over the net, but also spin rate. And those are all things that make a shot particularly effective, difficult to return, whatever it may be. And absolutely agree. The same applies in paddle. Obviously, the spin that paddle players use is slightly different. But as you say, slice and positioning and placement of the ball in particular areas is one of the things that you could definitely measure with those tracking systems to somehow have a view on the most effective modes of play or the most effective tactics and strategies.
Okay, so a lot of the primary reason that data is collected, or one of the pillars as we've talked through this, is fan engagement, this idea that fans want to understand better. I think David was right when he says that raw data can sometimes be just a sea of numbers that mean nothing, right? And also even data itself needs to be explained. When XG, expected goals, was delivered in the soccer football space, a lot of people were like, what the hell does that mean? I've never even seen this data point, and what does it tell me, and why is it relevant, and does it mean anything?
Yeah.
Do we find that actually consumers and fans are getting more data savvy, are getting more fluent with the language of the data that's being collected and presented to them, and they are baying for this extra layer? They're always wanting more, they're always wanting insight, or is it still actually quite a niche interest for a minority of the fan base?
Look, there's a lot in that question. I think the main thing is you need to, again, go back to the spectrum of the audience. So the data is providing different things for different segments. So players' welfare, coaches, tactical plans, game plans, players want their own performance. To your point, Ciaran, they want to have the information on their own performance to improve their performance. At times, they also want to hide some of that data in case it looks like they're not running as fast as they used to. The fan piece is interesting because it's a spectrum, everything from a deep data analytics paper or reporting system that is provided for coaching staff or player welfare. Explanation and education is still required, right through to any data-led content that you put up on a broadcast or in a mobile phone. It has to have an education element to it. So the sizzle can come in the visual overlay and the incredible graphics and things that we're all now seeing and using. And yes, gamification is absolutely how fans are consuming it. And we need to definitely all head there if we're wanting to retain a youthful market. But the key thing for me, Alex, is always about education. So whether that's education to commentators or whether that's education to coaches, you cannot expect data to be interpreted like a data scientist would, nor is that interesting to a fan. So the insatiable appetite for data-led content for sport is absolutely there. What's not there is 8 minutes of someone struggling to explain something that is so complex that it's irrelevant. So we have to, as people shaping some of these incredible opportunities in sport, we have to always be cognizant of who our audience is. I mean, Live Golf, we're very involved in that sport, and the gamification, the shake-up of the entire production and broadcast is unapologetic. And that is how that data is being consumed. There's fans of it, and there's people that are more traditional in their expectation of what a golf production should look like. But regardless, the absolute driver is data-led innovation and its gamification in terms of the graphics packages. So I think that we have to, as people, again, privileged enough to be working in the sports space, we have to recognize that sport data is not consumed like it used to be consumed. It's rare that fans will sit watching 2 hours of anything. So we also need to be really mindful of how we are constantly evolving and ensuring that we are providing insights that matter and storytelling that is something that keeps fans engaged in our sport.
And I think that's also why sports data generally has become such an intrinsic part of broadcast presentation now. If you go back 20 years, It's a completely different way of consuming the sport, and it has massively enhanced actually the viewer experience, right? If you look at sports like F1 or even golf, where you have the ball tracing technology now. Anyone who watched golf used to just be watching a screen of a tiny dot in the sky that you were lucky to be able to see, right, for significant parts of that, production process. Or even on a smaller scale, but things like sailing, where you can now have the virtual lines put across, again, using data that is being collected to enable people to work out actually who's leading. Or even on a big sport like the NFL, the 10-yard line on the NFL being superimposed. Now watching an NFL game without the superimposed 10-yard line would just seem completely bizarre and a way worse experience, right? So actually, I just think that evolution of the way data has become such an intrinsic part of sports presentation, and that's not going to change, right? And we continue to see kind of new innovation in those areas, but also some of the things that Ciaran is perhaps looking at from an analytics and performance perspective, they tend to flow through into the broadcast presentation over a period of time. We're now seeing things when we're watching an AFL game or a rugby game or a football game that only the analyst would have seen probably 5 years ago. And I think that evolution will continue. And it's great. I think it's great as a viewer of sport that we get more and more understanding and insight into actually what is driving great outcomes and great performance on the court or on the pitch.
Just to finish quickly, David, on that one, data obviously fuels this space. And I think as all sports come with more data-led strategies, I think one thing that we've seen in other sports that's really interesting is also the data experts coming into the sport and applying their insights in performance worlds. So we've seen people that now own football clubs that have built their funds from owning betting companies. So they've applied them edges into performance sport to raise the level of the game. That's something that maybe in a few years' time we'll start to see in padel, because there's definitely an expertise gap in the sport and in all sports in this space. So it could be a way to actually have a positive of being able to harvest some expertise and experience in there, which could be really, really interesting. But it needs the data. It needs a lot of data. It needs it to be accurate to be able to get there.
Before we wrap up, the one kind of big pillar that we haven't really touched on is betting. And a lot of sports, especially younger sports or sports that are maturing fast, they see betting on the horizon and they're in two minds. They kind of understand the benefits, but they kind of fear the boogeyman. They fear unlocking some kind of Pandora's box. So, David, can you talk a little bit about your background with Sport Radar, who provide the premium range of services to the betting industry? From Padel's point of view, Premier Padel has a betting partner, Betson. So there's clearly some kind of relationship already there. But just more generally, just for the industry to understand, what are the pros and cons of getting into bed and really building that strong relationship and embracing the betting piece of the match data ecosystem?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a big topic for a closer, Alex, but I'll do my best to summarize it. I think the key point for me, for anyone thinking about this from a sports rights holder perspective or the evolution of the sport, is that sports are bet on almost irrespective of kind of the decisions that rights holders take. If there is data about what happens in a sporting event, whether it's live data within the event or whether it's just the result of the event, that means that people can place a bet on it. And that is, almost as old as sport itself. So I think the starting point is, if you're organizing a sport and you want your sport to be in the public eye, whether it's through broadcast or streams or a data feed updating people on what's happening in that sport, the reality is betting can and will happen, and probably can and is already happening on your sport, even if you're not aware of it. So from my perspective, and as somebody who sat on the side of a sports data company that served the betting market amongst many other things, now sitting on the side of a rights holder, I guess my starting point, acknowledging that that's the reality, how do you make sure that you're delivering a good product and you're managing a relationship with the betting industry or with that part of the commercial opportunity in a way that can drive benefit for your sport, rather than, okay, it's going to be bet on, and therefore some of the risks that come with sports betting that we know about in terms of integrity and of players being corrupted in some way or throwing matches or doing things within the course of a match. Those issues have arisen in pretty much every sport around the globe, whether it's football, cricket, tennis, etc. So how do you insulate yourself from that? And I think our clear view is you have a strong commercial relationship. That enables you to have contractual restrictions and limitations and controls in terms of the way in which your data is being used and the information that you get back from the market. And then there are also well-established ways in which the data can be used from a monitoring perspective to actually monitor what is going on in your sport and what is at the same time happening on the global betting market to identify if unusual things are happening or if matches are prone to manipulation. And I think in the context of what we've talked about today, the use of data and the deeper use of data in that context gets really interesting, because with things like having better access and more detailed access to the norms of athlete performance, actually identifying whether an athlete is deliberately underperforming or is meaningfully underperforming in a match where something very unusual happens on the betting market, that gives an increased level of evidence as to actually has something untoward happened. So I think actually the data that we collect can be used for that very positive purpose to safeguard the sport and protect the sport from those sorts of risks, as well as being able to, as I said, if that relationship is managed in a sensible, proactive and positive way with the betting industry, it can not only derive commercial benefit, but it can also mean that you have a good system in place to ensure your sport can be as free from that risk of corruption as possible.
And you also saw in America, before betting was formally accepted about a decade ago, or maybe a bit less than that, fantasy sport was seen as a betting without the stigma. But effectively, the reason it was embraced by the sports leagues was because it created a psychological reason for people to be much more engaged with more of the matches and the content. And so the reality is that betting or having a stake on a result, whether it's financial or otherwise, has always been a key way of driving eyeballs, interest, time spent. And so I think on that point, Kate, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. How much has the embracing of betting made a real seismic difference to the level of viewership, level of engagement for the sports that you've dealt with?
Yeah, I think your point there is spot on. It's a reason to be invested, isn't it? As you said, a reason to stay, a reason to be engaged. That's absolutely correct. The interesting thing with betting has also been, I think, the evolution of betting in itself. So within sports, they could be multi-game bet as opposed to just betting on the result. Now there are multi-sport bets. So for tennis or any other sport, for paddle or for football, it's making things that are dynamic and exciting a reason to be a part of the sport. The funding that does come from that sector is considerable. So it's also utilising the funds to improve player welfare, performance, advancements of the sport. So I think the inevitability of it is obvious, and unashamedly, wagering is a key part of the sports industry around the world. But I think, to David's point, it's around the rigour and the discipline and the guardrails around it. But certainly it's a really important part of sport insofar as the resources, what can be done with the dollars that also come in from that sector of the industry. But the other thing that I wanted to mention is the integrity piece that David touched on. The officiating of all of these games, any sports, is largely dependent on improved funding. So it's all part of the advancement of the sport.
And I was only very quickly going to reinforce a couple of the points Kate made. As you said, when sports betting became potentially legalized in the US in 2018, there was a whole load of studies done actually on the level of engagement from people who were placing sports bets versus those who did not. And just in terms of volume of consumption, they were consuming more sport, they were watching more sport, they were consuming more ancillary content around sport, so second screen, or looking at data and analysis around the game. So I think you're absolutely right. There is a correlation there, which is, again, why the sports betting part of the commercial evolution of sports has become interesting, because to your exact point, the more engaged people are in the outcome of the event, the more likely they are to stick around.
Well, on that note, I think the way I would wrap it up is to say that match data is critical to insights, whether it's for fans and for players. It's critical for engagement and raising the level of viewership, and also revenue from either the commercial partners or also the betting industry. but it requires protection of integrity. It requires education to make sure that that data has context and meaning, and accuracy and consistency in terms of the way it's collected and presented. But I think it's encouraging to hear that the bottom line is that everyone's got a journey to go. Padel isn't many, many miles behind every other sport. In fact, it has an opportunity, because it's quite young and nimble, to steal a march and to try and showcase a much more innovative piece of it, similar to what the Professional Triathlete Organization has done. And so I think that's a positive thing. I'm more encouraged than when I started.
That's good.
But yes, thank you all for joining the call. I really appreciate it. And let's conclude here this episode of All the Angles, and we'll be back next week. Thank you very much.